History is filled with long-lasting countries and states which had a big impact on the world we know today. But today we'll be talking about the opposite of that. I'm Caro, and it's time to look back at the countries who came out to the world looking bright-eyed and ready for anything, just to immediately be ran over by a semi-truck. These are some failed countries deader than my nan. If you ever played the hit grand strategy game Hearts of Iron 4, you're probably A, a femboy, or B, a fascist, or realistically probably both. But you'll also know of our first failed country, Manchukuo. Manchukuo, officially known as the Great Empire of Manchuria, existed from 1932 to 45 and was located in northeastern China in the region of Manchuria, if you could believe it. The region of Manchuria up to that point had been a hotbed of imperial ambitions. In the mid-19th century, Russia yoinked out of Manchuria. As the ruling Qing dynasty continued to decline, Russian influence only ever grew. But then a new challenger appeared on the scene in the form of the recently industrialized Japan, which had come out of centuries of isolationism and wanted an empire of its own. This was before the cute kawaii arc. They were more interested in doing the whole crimes against humanity thing. In 1904, the two went to war in the Russo-Japanese War in order to cement themselves in the region. The European powers expected Japan to get curb stomped because racism, but a couple of battles and one sinking of the Russian fleet later, and the two were at the negotiating table. In the ensuing Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by the US, Japan was given free reign to do whatever they want in Korea. They also got control of Port Arthur with a permanent army stationed there. And most importantly, Russian influence in Manchuria was greatly reduced. However, there was general discontent in Japan over the peace, as many believed they hadn't gained enough from the war, and many believed Manchuria should come under direct control of Japan. Foreshadowing is a literary device in which, in 1911, the imperial Qing dynasty was overthrown in the Xinhai Revolution, and a Chinese republic was established. This lasted approximately 5 minutes before the entire country collapsed, and was overrun by warlords, thus beginning the warlord era, aka oh god, oh fuck, everything's on fire. At the same time, Japan annexed Korea, and with China destabilized, looked to expand into the region. At first they backed the warlord of the Fentang clique, Zhang Julin, but he wasn't being enough of a bitch boy, so the Japanese had him assassinated, hoping that his death would destabilize the region enough for them to get away with intervening. But his son succeeded him and was even more troublesome for the Japanese, so they decided, feck it, and set up a false flag attack. In this false flag attack, the Mukden incident, apparent Japanese controlled railway in Manchuria was blown up. Although nobody actually died in the incident, Japan blamed the Chinese and used it as an excuse to invade Manchuria. Japan's Kuomintang army quickly swept over the region, bringing it under the control. However, they were in a predicament. They didn't want to be seen as idiotic imperial assholes, so instead they opted to create a completely 100% free and definitely not a Japanese puppet state country. They even got some Qing loyalists, including the last emperor of China, Puyi, on board, because let's be honest, they weren't really doing much else. Despite this, the arbiter of global justice at the time, the League of Nations, which is pretty much the beta patch of the UN, somehow even more useless, heavily condemned this act of obvious expansionism. So Japan was like, fuck you, and left the league, which would lead to eggheads and angry art rejects of the world to also challenge the league's authority. Japan tried to challenge the allegations harder than me when I'm called a fur man. So in 1934, Manchukuo was officially declared a constitutional monarchy, Puyi at its head. So that way it was actually a continuation of the Qing dynasty. So actually it's legitimate. I'm not coping, I don't do imperialism, don't ask what happened in Nanyang, okay? In practice, this didn't really change much in the day-to-day running of the country. The running of the country was mostly left to the Japanese military, with Puyi and other government officials being virtually powerless. The state of Manchukuo only had limited international recognition, with only Axis members or Axis alliance states recognizing the country as legitimate. Most of the Soviet Union for some reason too, I don't know why. Japan tried to rectify this by promoting Manchukuo as a new multi-ethnic pan-Asian state. But despite this, 96% of its population was Chinese. Japan did encourage many Japanese settlers, however, particularly those of the poorer regions of the home islands, to settle in Manchukuo. By 1941, the population was 50 million, or approximately 1,217 Liechtensteins. Manchukuo was instrumental in Japan's invasion of China in 1937, mostly as a staging off point to the rest of China. The Manchukuoan army would have limited role in World War II, mostly being used to suppress Chinese guerrilla in northern China. The end of the war and Japan's defeat would ultimately mean the death of Manchukuo. The Soviet Union invaded the country on the 8th of August 1945, and the army completely collapsed, with entire units surrendering without even firing a shot. Thus came to an end the 13 years of existence of Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state that didn't do any war crimes. Don't Google Unit 731 for the love of God, please don't, I beg you, please don't. Our next failed country, and realistically the one you clicked in this video over because of one rage or two blind curiosity, the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States of America was a short-lived collection of 11 American states that seceded from the United States over the issues of, let me check real quick. States' rights, which is an awfully funny way to say slavery. In the mid-19th century, America could be roughly divided into two camps, racist and extra uber racist, also known as North and South. I'll let you figure out which is which. The North's economy was industrial, with cities like New York being incredibly urbanized. The South, meanwhile, was a rural agricultural society, mostly producing raw materials such as cotton. Except it turns out making cotton is pretty hard, thus they got enslaved black people to do it instead. The North was generally anti-slavery, with slavery being abolished in most northern states, and they did not want the institution to expand. The South, meanwhile, having an economic interest in preserving the practice. The Confederacy commenced after the election of Abraham Lincoln, who ran on a platform of, I don't like slavery, but I won't do anything about it. And obviously because the slaveholders of the South were the level-headed and rational individuals, they decided the best option was to create their own United States, with blackjack and slavery. South Carolina was the first state to secede on December 20th, 1960, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They formalized this in the Montgomery Convention, which is only the second worst type of convention I can think of. The American Civil War would begin on the 12th of April 1861, with the US controlled Fort Sumter being attacked by South Carolina militiamen. In response, Abraham Lincoln ordered an army to be raised to put down the rebellion. But in response to this, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee also seceded. From the onset, the would-be Confederate states didn't have the best odds. The northern states, aka the Union, had over double the population of the Confederacy, whose population was around 9 million, 3.5 of which were enslaved people, so giving them weapons wasn't in their best interest. Plus the whole uber racism thing meant that they were at a huge manpower disadvantage. The Union was far more industrialized, like a lot more. Plus the bigger Union Navy blockaded the Confederates, meaning that they couldn't export any of that cruelly collected cotton, meaning that they lost the one viable source of income that they had. And despite everything they tried, including some submarine shenanigans, they failed to break the Union blockade. Despite overwhelming odds, the filthy rebel scum did quite well at first. This was due to competent leadership, which the Union was sorely lacking in the first opening years of the war. But two failed invasions of the North, the Union breakthrough in the West, and on March to the sea later, the tide turned against the Confederacy. Its capital Richmond was captured on April 3rd, 1865, and a few days later, their best military commander, Robert E. Lee, surrendered to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Apparently having a random letter in your name was the fashion at the time, effectively bringing an end to the Civil War. Despite lasting only 4 years, the Confederacy would have a lasting impact on the United States. Despite being recognized by not a single country on the planet, the planter class after the war would wage a propaganda war within the United States to make themselves not look like a bunch of tyrannical enslaving traders. So they tried to frame the war as not one of slavery, but the aforementioned states' rights to do slavery, which took hold in the following century, although luckily modern historiography is trying to dispel the so-called lost cause myth. Is it working? I imagine the comment section of this video, if it gains any traction, will answer that. In conclusion, get a real country to suck the dick off traders. Now we've insulted one side of the political spectrum, it's time to do the exact same to the opposite side. The Bavarian Socialist Republic, a short attempt at creating a new revolutionary state that existed just as long as the chocolate cake when your man enters the room. Germany in 1918 wasn't doing the best. On the Western Front, the army was about to collapse, and our allies already had. The British naval blockade meant that everyone on the German home front was on the 1847 diet. That means starving to death. However, there were some in Germany that would rather go out in a blaze of glory than surrender. Two such people were Admiral Franz von Hipper and Reinhard Scheer, who ordered the remnants of the German fleet to board and engage the British fleet one last time. The sailors at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel had two choices at that point: go on an obvious suicide mission or not do that. So the sailors, not wanting a watery grave mutiny, had set up their own workers' councils or Soviets inspired by the Bolsheviks in Russia. The revolution quickly spread across Germany, and eventually Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate. A German Republic was then declared. The 1918 German Revolution was left-wing in nature, and if there's one thing leftists are good at, it's constant infighting. The main rivalry was between the Social Democrats, SPD, who wanted a parliamentary democracy, and the Independent Social Democrats, USPD, the latter who were in the Vlad Lenin fan club and wanted a more Soviet-style system, and were also really bad at naming their political party. But we're specifically going to be focusing on the events going on in Bavaria. Bavaria prior to 1871 had been an independent kingdom, but after the Franco-Prussian War agreed to join the new German Empire. Politically pre-war, Bavaria was dominated by the Centre Party, whose main purpose was to support the position of the Catholic Church within the new German state. But because although they loved Jesus, they didn't love that version of Jesus. Bavaria didn't have much of a socialist base pre-war is what I'm trying to say, which is a perfect start for the upcoming socialist revolution. During the chaos of the revolution, the King of Bavaria, Ludwig III, was forced to abdicate and flee the region, with workers and soldiers gaining control over the region, including the all-important city of Munich. Kurt Eisner of the Independent Socialists would be a key figurehead in Munich, but due to deteriorating conditions in the city, he proved unpopular. How unpopular? In the January 1919 elections, his party gained only only 2.5% of the vote within Bavaria. Because of this, he was forced to cooperate and make concessions to the SPD. Due to his dwindling power base, Eisner decided to resign, but on his way he decided to trip and fall into an assassin's bullet and subsequently died. The SPD then took over, but then an armed worker stormed the parliament building and shot a bunch of dudes, which led the SPD politician to hightail out of there because he didn't feel like ending up like Eisner. This left a power vacuum subsequently filled by Marx Levine of the newly formed German Communist Party, who wanted to implement a range of wide-sweeping revolutionary reforms. On the 7th of April 1919, Levine officially proclaimed this Bavarian Socialist Republic. But in reality, this didn't change much. People were still starving on the streets, other essentials like fuel were in critical shortage, and 40,000 of the city's population was unemployed. And this plays into a large issue with the short-lived republic. Nobody gave a shite about its existence. As previously mentioned, it had low public support from the outset. A lot of decisions leading up to its creation were desperate attempts by USPD and KPD politicians to survive and not end up like the failed Spartacus revolution in Berlin. Speaking of which, the moderate Social Democrats were still in Bavaria. Setting up in the town of Bamberg, they assembled an army of 8,000 men to take Munich, but were defeated by Levine's new Red Army. But just when you thought there'd be hope for the little Bavarian Republic, the government had the realization, hey, we successfully crossed the Spartacus rising by enlisting the help of right-wing sociopaths. Why don't we do it again? So they enlisted 30,000 Free Corps troops to attack Munich, which the small ill-equipped Red Army was no match. As the government troops entered northern Bavaria, remnants of the Red Army in Munich started executing any suspected enemies of the regime. When the Free Corps reached the city, not to be outdone in terms of war crimes, they summarily executed any suspected communists. Levine and all the other high-ranking politicians behind the Republic's creation were arrested and tried for high treason. Ultimately, they will all be sentenced to death, and Bavaria will be reabsorbed back into Germany, bringing an end to the short-lived revolutionary state. And that's all from me. If you enjoyed this look into some failed countries, make sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and maybe I'll make a part 2, I don't know. Also join my Discord server, link in the description, and bye.